Hello and welcome along to In Conservation with. My name is David Lindo, and I am very delighted to have with me tonight, this afternoon, this morning, Dr. Alex Lees, who, along with Dr. James Gilroy, has actually written a book which has recently come out. Is it actually out now, Alex, or is it
It's
out?
out now, yeah. Came out in December, out in the States in February.
Okay, the book's called Vagrancy in Birds, and I'm sure you have a copy to this flash in front of us,
I
Alex.
do. Here it is.
Fantastic.
Glorious Technicolor.
Fantastic. And we're going to be talking about vagrants tonight, and vagrancy, and why, and how, and all that sort of stuff. I just want to say a couple of things. Firstly, tonight is sponsored by Leica Sport Optics and the Diputación de Cáceres, which is the northern province of Extremadura in southern or southwestern Spain, and they are the tourism board that looks after that side of the world. Let me just quickly tell you about Alex. Dr. Alex, or Alexander, even to his friends, is a senior lecturer at the in biodiversity at Manchester Metropolitan University. And I'll tell you one thing, after reading his book, I defy anyone not to sort of give up their lives and go to Manchester and study with this guy, have this guy teach you, because it's amazing what he's written about, and we're going to be talking about it tonight. He's a research associate for the Cornell Lab of Ornithology in the USA. He's previously worked for 5 years as a as a postdoctoral fellow at the Goeldi Museum in Brazilian?
Yeah, Geldi Museum, the Museu Parentes Emilio Geldi. So it's sort of in the mouth of the Amazon.
Okay, great. You've written a book about vagrancy. Before I go further, I must say that I've been a major fan of Alex for some time now, since he was a kid. He still is a kid, by the way. One of the things that he and his friends did in the past was create this group called the Punk Birders. And they were, as the name suggests, quite out there in terms of their attitude and the way they acted in terms of birding. But one thing I loved about them in particular was the fact that he and his friends would decide, right, we're going to go to that island over there because no one's going there, and we're going to find something. And invariably they did. I remember going to Kerry on Spec a couple of years ago, and the birders still speak highly of the punk birders, even though you haven't been there for quite a long time. You're in the history books there, fella. Can you give us a quick breakdown as to the punk birder, and are they now the defunct birders?
Well, they're not the defunct birders, I guess, anymore. We're just the sort of slightly more grown-up birders with less free time, which is a little bit sad. I guess a lot of those sort of last trips to those exciting places like Kerry and such like are all for sort of stag do's and such like. So I guess more people need to get divorced and remarried or something to be able to prize us away from, living in different parts of the world and having full-time jobs in consultancy or academia or NGOs. But we do occasionally meet up, and hopefully there'll be some foreign trips that we might be sort of in our dotage by then, and where the kids have fledged it, such like so probably less sort of falling over stone walls and such like, but hopefully still finding some rare birds in the future.
Fantastic. Now, let me just let's start right at the very beginning. Let's talk about vagrants. Why birds are vagrant? For me, I think that every species is a vagrant somewhere. Is that a correct sort of assumption to make?
I guess so. I mean, so vagrancy. It's quite hard thing to define, really. In the book, we sort of talk about a vagrant as being an individual of a species which is occurring outside of its normal geographic range. So if you think about, and you're looking at a bird book, and there's a distribution map. Part of that is green, or maybe it's yellow and blue, or whatever, depending on if the bird's migratory. And if it's a record of a bird is in the white bit, if it's in the bit that isn't coloured, then it's nominally a vagrant. Except that, a lot of birds, their distributions, they don't suddenly sort of immediately stop in space, for instance. Birds get rarer and rarer towards the range edge. Maybe there's the odd pair breeding outside of that normal area, for instance. But the further and further we get from that edge of the range, the more likely something is to be a vagrant. In some contexts, for instance, in the United Kingdom, it's really obvious that short-toed tree creeper is a vagrant, right? Because, it doesn't breed in the UK. It's a resident species. We occasionally get odd individuals coming over from France. Whereas another species like an icterine warbler, for instance, it's less obvious whether it's a vagrant because, there are birds migrating north up along the North Sea coast. They get drifted over, for instance. So many people think of it as a scarce migrant. So sometimes it can be hard to draw that line, but basically it means it's outside of its normal distribution range. And worth pointing out as well that vagrants aren't only sort of a bird-specific phenomenon, right? Quite a lot of birders themselves probably visited a walrus last year, which was hanging out in various places. In fact, 2 walruses, right, which is also nominally a vagrant because they don't normally stray down from the Arctic. And then we have, vagrant butterflies and even vagrant orchids appearing on rooftops in southern Britain as well. So not only a bird-specific phenomenon, but best known in birds.
It's funny because when I was a kid, when I took this book from the library at the age of 7, and I've still got it, by the way, but the library's closed down, and plus I'm in Spain, so I can't really return it anyway. But I remember going through it as a kid and seeing the maps of birds, and at that point I was living in North London, a kid, I'd know what to take me anywhere. And I remember looking at the maps, and I used to write lists of potential vagrants in each country I could recognise, ones that stuck out the most I can recognise, like Finland or Spain even, or And looking back now, I can see that things have changed so much, even in the last 30, 40, 50 years. In your book, you talk about vagrancy, of course, but you talk about the changing patterns in terms of migration. For example, yellow-browed warblers, which I suppose historically were birds that nested in Northern Asia and headed south into Southern Asia. Now things have changed. I mean, even more locally in the UK, or in Europe, should I say, you've got your black caps that are now migrating west instead of south even. So what is the ecological benefit of migration, and how does that tie into vagrancy?
So key first questions are why do birds migrate, right? And migration evolves because resources, nesting sites or food or whatever, can be available at some times of the year for some species, and some places and not others, right? So barn swallows can't live here in the UK in winter because there are no flying insects, but there's lots of flying insects in summer. So it's worthwhile leaving the tropics to come and breed in the UK because there are fewer competitors, fewer other species of hirundines, right? But over evolutionary time, landscapes change, species compositions change, habitats change, and everything else. So bird migration has to be dynamic. Otherwise, species would never colonize new areas. And I guess how dynamic, it's only really becoming apparent to us, quite recently when we see sort of big changes in ranges for species like lesser blackback gulls, for instance, which sort of colonized Greenland via Iceland and is now quite a regular bird on the US East Coast, for instance, where, sort of 50, 60 years ago, it was a real vagrant. And now you can find flocks of hundreds in Florida. Or another good example in Europe is pallid harrier, which was sort of a legendary vagrant in Britain up until start of the 1990s. And is now, occurs annually in small numbers. And this has been associated with a big westward range expansion of the species, which is now breeding in Scandinavia and even recently in Spain and the Netherlands. And those birds, rather than migrating a long way to wintering areas in India, for instance, are migrating a shorter distance to wintering areas in West Africa. So, we think of those maps you're talking about in the Heinzelfitter and Parslow earlier, the book. I mean, those change quite rapidly, and and they have to change. Otherwise, birds won't be able to adapt to all the sort of changes that we're throwing at them through climate change and land use change, etc.
It's interesting you talk about the lesser blackback gull, because I remember speaking to you last week about that bird. I was looking through my book, my guidebook to North America, and read that the lesser blackback gull, despite being seen in more numbers now on the East Coast, no one's ever found a nest. And I was thinking, how the hell could that be? Because you can walk into almost any city in southern Britain and you'll bump into a ton of lesser blackbacks nesting right in front of you. But you had an explanation for that, didn't you?
Yeah, so it's likely that the lesser blackback gulls, most of the birds we see in the eastern US and Canada are from Greenland, rather than breeding in North America sensu stricto, if you like. But it is possible they could be breeding somewhere up Labrador and these areas. And this is really, really remote areas with very, very few people visiting them and really no people living there. In fact, we sort of, in many ways, we know less about, the birds of some of these remote places in the sort of eastern Arctic of North America than we do about birds in the middle of the Amazon basin, where I do most of my work, for instance. So it's likely up there probably are some lesser black gulls breeding there. It's probably also likely there are ruffs breeding and probably little gulls and probably Eurasian widgeon, because all these species are quite regular in North America as well in small numbers. And ruff has actually been seen lekking in the Canadian Arctic. And it's a species which, there are small numbers get seen on passage in North America. And indeed, they get as far as South America. So I was lucky enough to find one a few years ago in the Brazilian Amazon on the coast there. And I identified the first sort of documented ruff from Brazil, whilst browsing images on a sort of Brazilian citizen science website called WikiAvis. I think I found the second one on there as well. So again, probably also missed within sort of big groups of other waders when people aren't thinking about them. So there are probably lots of these species which have, you could sort of go, well, a term we coined basically pseudo-vagrancy about 20 years ago is this idea that when you go for a bird which is a vagrant, this bird is lost, it's turned up somewhere it shouldn't do, to when a population is founded and those birds are heading to a place on purpose, coming back and breeding, going back again. The problem is when a population is very small, it's difficult to know if that's just a high background volume of lots of vagrants or it's the start of this new population evolving. And that's something that has been recently proven in very exciting fashion for Richard's pipit in Western Europe, for instance. Richard's pipit, which a bird which David is certainly very familiar with, probably from Spain and from the UK, is sort of what we normally think of as being a sort of a Siberian species, most in winter in India and or in Southeast Asia, but we see them regularly in Western Europe. So we have two options there. Are these Richard's pipits, which are for some reason they've failed to navigate correctly, they've ended up in Western Europe, or they've for some reason been blown off course, which is what everyone always talks about with vagrants, right? This idea of the weather being the decisive factor. Or are they birds which know exactly where they're going, they're on a migration route to their winter quarters unknown, and it's a sort of a normal biological phenomenon except at small numbers. So there was a team of mostly sort of French researchers led by Paul Dufour, who put little geolocators on Richard's pipits they caught in France and Spain, and those birds returned to breed in Russia and then came back the next year. So it showed that they were basically what this sort of, it validated this idea of these birds are pseudo-vagrants. So they're basically at the start of a new population, a new wintering population, these birds have been founded. And David mentioned yellow-browed warblers earlier on. It's possible that something is similar has happened with yellow-browed warblers, but we don't have enough evidence to say we can't basically rule out the fact that maybe it's just yellow-browed warblers are just a very, very common bird in Siberia, and lots of them go wrong, for instance, every year. Because we can't rule that out as a possibility. My feeling is that there are probably birds returning, and there's probably somewhere along this route to establishing a new population, but those alternative competing hypotheses, if you like, can't be ruled out.
Let's talk about the actual act of migration that we started talking about earlier. What can go wrong, or is there such a thing as going wrong? I mean, you talked earlier about the classic phrase blown off course or lost its way. Is that actually true, or do you think that, I mean, I suppose you kind of answered it slightly previously, but I mean, is there such a thing as actually getting it wrong? Do young birds get it wrong sometime?
Yeah, there are lots of ways which a bird can become a vagrant, and forget about all the pseudo-vagrancy stuff. We're talking about birds which are lost. They're going somewhere they shouldn't be. So that can happen for factors which are internal and factors which are external. And it's the external ones which tend to sort of get in the newspapers, tend to sort of fill people's sort of thoughts about vagrants. So this idea of the weather as being this key external factor. And the weather is important. So every year in Western Europe, we get very small numbers of land birds from North America, attractive, brightly coloured warblers, as well as some orioles, and even the sort of tanagers, scarlet tanager, and such like, and various species of North American land birds. There's a belted kingfisher just up the road from us here in northwest England at the moment, for instance. So these are birds which in autumn migrate in huge numbers down the eastern seaboard of the United States, Some of them even migrate across the water. So they're migrating out of the ocean to cut the corner to head to South America, like black-billed warblers and red-eyed vireos. And those birds are exposed potentially to a sort of severe storm events on the migration, which can, if they get stuck in a fast-moving depression as it crosses the Atlantic, they can't fly back against it because they have to fly downwind, because you can't fly against, a 650-mile-an-hour headwind or whatever. So they'll fly downwind, and the lucky ones will make landfall in Europe. Most of them will probably die en route because they don't have enough fat reserves to make it. And of those lucky ones which arrive, some of those will be discovered by birds. So those are vagrants which are storm blown or whatever. We can have sometimes in spring a phenomenon we call overshooting. So if birds are heading, from Africa to go to their breeding areas, for instance, near David's house in Spain, sometimes with very fine weather, they may continue going. They may overshoot their intended destination, helped by nice southerly winds and nice warm weather, and end up on the Isles of Scilly or Cornwall or Brittany or somewhere else. So that's also a sort of weather-driven phenomenon, but it might also be linked with an internal phenomenon, which is just a failure on the bird's account to stop migrating, right? Because birds migrate, a lot of them, with what we sort of call a clock and compass strategy. So the bird has this innate programming which says it has to migrate for X number of days in X direction, and then perhaps for some species after that, another X number of days in direction Y, for instance. Now, if that bird migrates, if that sort of hard wiring with the bird is somehow faulty, they may either migrate in the wrong direction, they may migrate for too long, and they'll end up arriving somewhere where they shouldn't be based on those pre-programmed instructions. And there are a number of potential faults with those instructions, which can happen either because of some sort of mutation, or in some instances, maybe because of some environmental feature. So in the book, we talk a bit about magnetic anomalies potentially influencing bird, and that might be literally space weather, sort of charged particles in the atmosphere which interfere with the ability to navigate, or it might be related to geographical landforms with sort of high degrees of with lots of rock, for instance, radioactive rocks or whatever, which can influence basically the bird's ability to navigate, which may predispose some areas to have high rates of vagrancy, or some years, for instance, to have high rates of vagrancy. I don't want to give too much away, but I was at a conference recently. I saw some really interesting information coming on this. I sort of watched this space for some other folks' work on vagrancy and these anomalies, for instance. One of the most simple ones, and which we sort of wrote about, sort of starting back nearly 20 years ago now, was looking at the impacts of what was broadly termed sort of reverse migration. So the idea that a bird might get the sort of the compass bearing wrong, and instead of heading north, it might head south, or in the case of mirror image, it might head east instead of west. There's a sort of simple sort of mutations or errors, for instance, which might cause a bird to go somewhere completely different. But in truth be told, if you actually look at the data, you can find, for lots of species, you can find records in all sorts of different directions. So although sort of reverse and mirror might be quite common, there seems to be a far, far greater spread in records in many species.
But it's hard to become romantic when you look at a bird. It's often, even in bird magazines and rarity reports, it's this lost waif or what have you. And I can't help but feel like, for example, the Seller's sea eagle in North America doing the rounds at the moment, it's traversed the whole of North America, it seems. To me, looking at that cold, you kind of think, the guy's lost. He's trying to find his mates. He's drifting around thinking, oh, where are my mates? I was with them, 6 months ago. Where are they now? So what do you think what is the deal with that bird, for example? And by the way, for those who don't know, there's been, well, actually you can tell them, you probably know more about it than I do, actually.
So there's an amazing record of a vagrant Steller's eagle, which is the world's heaviest eagle, right? So always vies for those when people do eagles playoffs, right, versus harpies or whatever else. But if not, it's probably the world's largest eagle. Certainly seems to have the biggest beak. It's a huge sea eagle, sort of within the same grouping as and white-tailed, and they basically live in northeast Russia. They breed in sort of Kamchatka and Chukotka, and then a lot of them sort of migrate south to winter in Japan. So you've probably seen the nice pictures of them sitting on ice floes in Hokkaido or whatever. So it's a very, very vagrant to North America, and prior to the last sort of 2 years, all the records basically from Alaska and outlying islands in the Bering Sea, Pribilos, etc. And then 2 years ago, one showed up in interior of Alaska. It was going to be near Juneau, and then sort of progressively wandered. It seems like the same bird, which was photographed in Texas, and then it sort of went back north, and it was definitely the same bird, which was photographed in Arctic Canada, and it worked its way further and further east, sort of through Labrador, and then ended up in Nova Scotia, and then it moved south into Massachusetts, and now it's in sort of Maine. And it's obviously been massively twitched, possibly one of the most twitched birds in North America of all time. Wouldn't be surprised if it ended up with sort of those sort of credentials. And obviously sort of heinously lost and wandering around, obviously looking for another Steller sea eagle, sort of condemned potentially to wander around North America forever looking for another member of its own species, right? And there are other examples like that. We've sort of got this blackbird albatross, or probably multiple blackbird albatrosses wandering around the North Sea and attending gannet colonies. And, you know, those birds, given that they don't breed, potentially live for a very, very, very long time, right? Breeding, all animals that end up breeding often will end up living less time because of the stress associated with it. So an albatross or an eagle which doesn't breed will wander and wander and wander for potentially for a very, very long time. I guess we can sort of anthropomorphize those who feel sorry for it a bit, but I guess that bird is a bit lonely potentially.
We've got a question there from Jane Stiliano. I hope I've pronounced your name right, but can you actually, do you want to come on and actually ask your question, Jane? Jane? Okay, well, her question is, do you feel that vagrants probably perish in the area where they arrive at, or and are unable to reach their intended location? She's thinking specifically about passerines.
Yeah, so great question. I guess it depends on the key thing is here is what sort of ecologists would call the environmental barriers they've crossed, right? We talked earlier about blackpoll warblers, which are, you know, migrating from Canada, doing this huge, great big migration across the North Atlantic to drop down to northern South America. It seems very, very unlikely those birds could possibly get back to South America, and if they try, they're likely to die. So for those North American species, it seems very unlikely that they could reorientate. For Siberian species or for Eastern European species, which we might see in Europe in the autumn, there's a little bit of evidence that some of those species might get back. So there's ringing recoveries, for instance, of some Siberian species from Western Europe, which subsequently recovered in Eastern Europe. So it seems for those, they could potentially get back. We know for waterfowl, that birds have definitely got back. There were ring-necked ducks, which have been ringed in the UK, have then been sort of shot in Greenland or shot in North America or whatever. So we know that those birds can get back. And for species which are wandering far smaller different distances, then, you know, quite likely they could get back. Although, you know, it depends on whether or not they end up being predated or end up something else bad happens to them, because they're ostensibly beyond their normal range limit, so they might not be able to tolerate the cold, they might not know what the potential predators there are, they might then find food. So there's lots of potential barriers which will mean that the chance of dying for those individuals is higher. But if they don't die, then, you know, amazing things can happen over what we call evolutionary time. You know, if most vagrants do die, fine, but imagine somewhere like Hawaii, right out in the Pacific. It's a place which annually gets vagrants, even from some species from North America, some species from Russia. Most of those birds probably die. Some of those birds might try and get back to where they're going, but over evolutionary time, over millions of years, some of those vagrants have arrived there, have stayed there, and have become new species. And about 10% of all the world's birds live on islands. And if we didn't have vagrants, we'd have 10% fewer birds on Earth. And that's not just in island systems as well, but when birds mountain range or whatever and enter a new area, it could be an act of vagrancy, but it will start a new population. So over very long timescales, the ones that do make it, you know, are super important for maintaining biodiversity. And I'm talking to David about this today, but not just bird biodiversity, right? A bird, you know, imagine you're a vagrant black duck, and you've, or probably a bad example, it's not really a Western North American species, a vagrant mallard, for instance, you've arrived on Hawaii, and you brought with you viable seeds in your gut, even viable eggs of things like fish can survive passing through a bird's digestive system. Or maybe there's bits of pondweed wrapped around your legs or whatever. Not to mention any sort of other pathogens or parasites you might be carrying. And those things as well are then transported to an island in the middle of nowhere. And suddenly you're kickstarting the evolution of multiple different species just associated with one vagrant bird, which might end up dying, but it might end up to the evolution of a new species of pondweed, for instance.
Fascinating. Paul Dietrich, and I'm terrible with names, so I apologize. Do you want to ask you a question about Bonaparte skulls?
I have to unmute Mike.
The thing is, I can't see anyone here. Paul, can you talk? All right, so we have to ask the question for him then. Bonaparte's skull, and that's been at all marshes in Kent for the past 5 or so summers. Is that a vagrant? And where does it go in winter? Does it go back to North America? Or does it hang out with, I'm adding a bit more to your question, Paul. Does it hang out with black-headed gulls and head south, or go to London or whatever?
It's a good question again. I have seen that bird. I did see, in fact, I saw that bird. We're going to see a wedding of another punk bird, a friend of mine, Dave Smith. In fact, I did see a Dave Smith on the call earlier, so I'm not sure if that's a Dave Smith or the Dave Smith or whoever. But anyway, so this is a returning individual of a new world, a Nearctic gull species, which has been present regularly in Kent. My guess is, I don't know. Could that bird might be going back to North America? It's quite possible. We know there are records of things like ring-billed gulls which have returned. And in fact, quite excitingly, there's a ring-billed gull recently which has been a satellite tag has been put on in Poland, and that bird is currently in the Netherlands. So it'll be interesting to see what happens to that bird if that flies back to North America. Or it's possible that Bonaparte's gull, you know, hangs out spends its entire life now in Europe and hangs out forlornly at black-headed gull colonies. We're only ever going to know this by tracking these birds. So, you know, and sort of putting tags on them, which are obviously quite expensive. Otherwise, it would probably happen more often. But I think this is the real sort of the most exciting things we're going to learn about vagrancy will come with some of these sort of tracking technologies on individual birds, because the problem with bird ringing is it only really works when you can ring lots and lots and lots of birds to get enough recovery. So which is not the case with vagrants, which is why we know so little. But now we have these new technologies and we can seek out an individual bird and put a tracking device on it. We have a much better idea of what's going on. So could be one or the other. It might be stuck here for the rest of its life, or maybe it's breeding every year in North America and just really likes the North Kent coast and returns every year. You know, who knows?
One of two really great things I learned in your book, not that they're the only two things, but the first thing was I didn't realize that birds could also use sound to migrate. You talked about hooper swans often potentially hearing the waves crashing on the shore before they even see it. And the other thing is the fact that the actual, when you look up, you know, you think of the space between you and the clouds as one sort of vacuum, well, not even a vacuum, but one area of air. But it's multi-layered, isn't it? There's some areas of wind, some areas still, and it's like levels. And I never really appreciated that. That's quite a fascinating thing. So how does that particular element of migration, how does that affect vagrancy?
Yeah, well, I guess so. Both of these issues, I mean, I always tell students this as well. The way we perceive the world, we are this diurnal visual primate. And when we try and understand animal behavior, animal taxonomy, or anything else, we're constrained by the way that how we perceive the world. And it's great that we're sort of building up this scientific knowledge base with these new technologies. But we often forget about how other species perceive the environment because we can't hear infrasound, for instance. So there's lots of sort of emerging studies now thinking, you know, sort of escaping from that comfort zone of being a diurnal visual primate like we are and thinking about how other species perceive the world. So the first thing David mentioned there was infrasound, and there was a really cool paper that came out on seabirds just a couple of weeks ago, actually. So not cited in the book, but it's totally new, and showing how important infrasound is for seabirds. I mean, they know where the coast is, even if they're a very long way away from it, because they can hear this infrasound, this low frequency noises of waves crashing on the cliffs, basically. And so for migrating birds, migrating across water, can potentially detect the coastline from a very, very long way away, which is why, for instance, we get something that James and myself coined the sort of the Fair Isle effect, and something I guess we'll talk a bit more about later on when it comes to these concentration effects with birds. But essentially, Fair Isle is this isolated rock with massive cliffs in the middle of the North Atlantic, and birds can potentially hear those water crashing into those cliffs from a very, very long way away. So that may mean that this difference between life and death for vagrants, or indeed for migrants, is their ability to detect where land is. So the second part of your question was about our perception of the sky, right? We look up at it, as David says, think about this sort of homogeneous feature, but the sky is incredibly dynamic, right? Most of the time we only experience the sky in our very sort of limited interaction with it, with however tall you are, up to 2 meters tall or whatever. And we don't get to understand all these sort of boundary layers with different air masses moving in different directions. And I think this is something that most birders haven't really cottoned onto, but there are tools online. For instance, you can look at, I think it's Ventuski, the web app, for instance, and look at which direction the wind's moving at different altitudes. And sometimes we're looking at ground level winds and we think, oh, easterly looks great. And actually at the altitude most birds are flying, it's a northerly or it's a southerly or even a westerly. So birds have to navigate through these air levels to basically find areas with a good wind direction. But they might also become trapped, for instance, by adverse weather conditions, which means that they may be moved. Some individuals may be moved off course because they're unable to find their way up through these layers. And we sort of know about this through technologies like accelerometers and that look at the way the birds are interacting with different air pressure masses, basically. And the birds will move up and down, through the levels, depending on the different wind speeds and trajectories along their migration route. So again, there's a lot that can go wrong there. And we've talked about external drivers and internal things. And then, the weather itself is incredibly dynamic. So, I mean, migration is an amazing challenge. So it's not unsurprising that birds quite often get it wrong.
You speak a lot about urban scenarios, and I think a lot of us urban birders realise that urban areas are, I suppose, islands. Because, for example, my local patch in West London, Wormwood Scrubs, is completely surrounded by urbanity, and half of it's actually just football pitches and rugby pitches. The other half is a little wild, but it's not. It's wilder than the surrounding area. But I've always had the thought in my head that a bird can be attracted to even the tiniest habitat that relates to it. I remember, for example, in Hyde Park, there's a tiny reed bed the size of a small room, and 2 bearded tits showed up, and it was the first record for inner London. So I think there is this whole thing, isn't there, where birds can be found in certain habitats within urban areas. I mean, you yourself, you found stuff near to where you are in Manchester, haven't you?
Absolutely, yeah. In fact, just to hold that thought a second with the bearded tits, another feature of birds migrating may be smell. So it's possible that those bearded tits, when they're migrating ahead, they can detect and smell that reed bed from quite a long way off. And I remember once I dug a tiny pond in my parents' garden in Lincolnshire, literally, like size of my laptop here nearly, and 8 reeds in it or whatever, and I had a sedge warbler in that once. So it wouldn't surprise me if a lot of these birds are really good at homing in on these specific cues. But yeah, so David's talking about a phenomenon I mentioned earlier on called, that we sort of birders sort of broadly term concentration effects, right? This idea that as birders, we want to gravitate to the areas where migrants occur in their largest numbers, right? So in the UK, that tends to be isolated islands. People end up going to places like Fair Isle, the Scillies, because if those birds are migrating across the ocean, they get drawn into these small patches of habitat, and those small patches of habitat are nested. They sit within a huge expanse of not suitable habitat, the sea, right? Birds aren't landing on the sea, or if they do, they're likely to die, right? But the same thing goes is if a bird flying over London, a lot of that habitat is no good for that bird, right? And so it's going to gravitate towards the good bits of habitat, which will be the small parks. And so the more isolated a park you have, and the more sort of hostile that non-habitat matrix of concrete and buildings it is, the greater the chance of finding a rare bird is. So I'm sort of now based in the northwest. I sort of live on the edge of the Peak District here. I spend quite a lot of time looking in remote sort of valleys with a couple of trees here, because it's all sort of quite desolate grouse moors, and trying to find rare birds in some of these little valleys without much success. But I've had a lot more success looking for rare birds, often quite passively, in the middle of Manchester, just in small urban parks. So a couple of weeks ago, well, 2 months ago now, I guess the end of November, there was I took a visiting PhD student of mine, Brazilian. So she just arrived in the country. She's desperate to go birding, so we had to dispense a load of formalities and getting her registered and everything else. And it didn't have any bins or anything else. We just went outside into this tiny park, like about a hectare in size, to try and hopefully show her first Dunnock or robin. I wouldn't even guarantee them in this park because it's so terrible and small or whatever. And we were sitting there having their lunch, and I spotted a little bird zip past. I didn't have any bins or anything, but I was pretty sure it was a warbler. And sort of walked up to this bush, started fishing, and then out popped this acro head. Luckily, I had a little camera, so I was looking down the sort of viewfinder of the camera, and this thing popped its head out. And I was like, "Oh my god, it's a Blythe Reed warbler in the middle of Manchester in the snow in November." And I'd also, in the neighbouring park, I found a yellow-browed warbler a few years ago, and then a Siberian chiffchaff, like almost in the middle of the building there. There's like at the John Dalton building where I work, there's like a courtyard with like one tree in the middle of it. And a couple of Februaries ago, there was a Siberian chiffchaff in that one tree for about 10 minutes. So, birds flying over the middle of Manchester at night. It's got to drop down at dawn. Where's it going to go? It's going to drop into the nearest available habitat. And you've probably got as good a chance of finding a rare birds in cities than you have in any other location inland, I'd imagine, in Britain, and maybe even in some places on the coast. I mean, if you imagine you're going to a coastline where it's all huge amounts of woodland and vast amounts of scrub, where do you look, right? You've got no concentration effect. So I think, maybe we're missing something in birding in Britain a bit. It's thinking about these sort of parks and thinking about these concentration effects in these urban areas. And I guess my first experience of that was really living in Southern California as part of my undergrad, and a lot of the time there in sort of Orange County, in southern end of Los Angeles County, we're just birding these urban parks like Huntington Central Park, like a 1 kilometer square park in the middle of the largest sort of population centers on Earth, which are really, really good birding areas. The same is true of Central Park in the US as well. One of the biggest bird lists of any site in Eastern North America. So, I think a lot more urban birding will produce a lot more rarities.
No, I totally agree. I mean, I too birdied Los Angeles for 13 years on the trot when I used to work in the film industry, and I developed local patches, and with other birders we found lots of really interesting stuff. And similarly in London, at Bournemouth Scrubs, I've had all sorts, 3 Richards pipits over 12 years, little bunting, Ortolan bunting, all sorts of stuff. So that kind of leads me to this whole thing, which excites me immensely. And I want to tell everyone to do this. And I've been doing this myself personally in my own way, which is, people often go to areas to go birding and they think, I must go there because that's where all the birds are. And they ignore from their house to that spot where they have to go to see the birds. So what kind of advice would you give? Because, for example, you, in your punk birder past, and I'm sure you'd do it now if you had the time, you said, as we said right at the very beginning of this conversation, right, we are going to that island. No one ever goes there. We're going to hang out there for a week and just work it. What kind of advice do you give to people wanting to find rare birds? Because, like it or love it, a lot of people love, looking for rare birds. I mean, I remember as a younger person thinking, how come they always found the right rare birds? How come I can never find a rare bird? And I think a lot of it's down to hard work, but there must be some degree of planning, no?
Yeah, absolutely. I think Google Earth is really your friend here. And it's looking at Google Earth and imagining being a bird, right? And imagining not knowing, knowing nothing about that area. You're flying over this habitat, so where are you going to go and why? And then it's about knowing about what other birds are doing, right? I mean, you can fly over the Norfolk coast and you'd be like, well, that looks a great place if I was a wader to land there. And you realize, well, it's Clyde next to the sea, and there's already been 50 people that have checked that marsh before you've even got out of bed or managed to get to the Norfolk coast, for instance. Although, you know, that might be true of waders or gulls or whatever, but what about a passerine along that coast? Where's that going to drop in? You know, and that might be an isolated woodlot 2 kilometers inland, which no one has ever looked at, for instance. So it depends on the species. And I guess people are very, you know, we think about what we're going to find and people think, well, I'm going to go look for ducks or gulls or something which is easy to find because they're going to be predictably at these places are really good for them. That just isn't true of most passerines, for instance, which, you know, could turn up virtually anywhere. In that case, you're just thinking about, you know, where is the sort of most isolated area which is going to draw these in? You know, if I lived in the New Forest, you'd be looking at a massive expanse of forest and trying to find some tiny clearing in the middle of it, which might be the spot which a dusky warbler will drop into the edge of, for instance. Versus, you know, being in the middle of the Lincolnshire Fens and you're looking for a tiny woodlot entirely surrounded by fields of sugar beet or whatever. So it's, you know, it's about thinking like a bird and thinking where those concentration effects are, and they're not always on the immediate coast. Then if David, did you ever get out to like the vagrant traps in the deserts in California, for instance, which, you know, to a British bird, it would seem unusual to go look for Siberian birds in a desert in California, but there are various vagrant traps, these oases, which, you know, have pulled things in like Kern Hill, I think eye-browed thrush, and I think they had probably a Kamchatka leaf warbler there, and along with lots of eastern vagrants as well. So, you know, it's just anywhere that's a bit different, I guess, and set in a different habitat context, and then thinking about, well, does that get looked at? So going back through the records and see, are people patching this or whatever, or even thinking about different times of year as well, right? I mean, birders often sort of think, well, when am I going to look for rarities? Or May and September, October, or whatever. But, you know, a lot of the rarest birds, a lot of vagrants show up in November, or if you wanted to go out and find, you know, an Upchur's warbler, that would probably be best in early to mid-August, for instance. So there's lots of times of the year when lots of good places don't get coverage either. I think we often just sort of think about the obvious things to find in the obvious localities when there's, you know, lots and lots of other possibilities.
How do you, Alex Lees, how do you bird? When you go out, how do you bird? I mean, what do you do? How do you find birds?
So most of my birding these days is spent sort of either on foot from my house around some pretty bleak Peak District reservoirs that don't pull many birds in, or sort of pottering around parks on the way to and from work, and then occasionally I'll get the odd trip out further afield, and then I've sort of family holidays now. I've got a young young little boy who's going to turn, well, going to be turned 2 in July or whatever. We took him to Scilly, basically. The only trip I've done recently was a spring holiday in April of last year. And sort of one glorious afternoon, I got about the only additions to my self-found list I've had for at least a couple of years, with a woodchuck shrike and a bee eater. And that was, you know, just wandering around the north end of Tresco. And if I see a bird, you know, I make sure I identify it. And it might seem obvious, but unless you've actually looked at every bird you've seen and actually ruled out something rare, then you're potentially going to be throwing birds away. You know, I think back to that Bly's reed warbler in the park in Manchester. I could have so easily walked away from that. But because I was like, well, I've got to work out what it is, because whatever it is, the tick for my brilliant PhD student who's never looked at European birds, I definitely went to look at it, even though I didn't have any bins. And I might not have found the Bly's reed warbler had I not chased up each individual bird. And I think that's something we do very easily. And it's very easy to do that, scanning through long, big flocks of ducks or whatever. And your brain can easily just sort of repeat that search image. And counting helps, I think, a lot. Spend more time counting common birds, which means you generate lots of good data for scientists. So putting your data into BirdTrack or eBird or whatever, that helps too, because it forces you to identify everything you're seeing. And then doing things differently as well, you know, varying your routine a bit, going to different places, you know, and this needn't be the ends of the earth, even just places locally, and then getting a feel for where, I regularly see the odd willow warbler or chiff-chaff out of context in this area, so maybe that will be the spot where a yellowbrow is going to drop into. So a lot of just observing observing common birds and thinking about what they're doing, but also making sure you definitely identify everything and don't let anything go, because it's the stuff you let go that will be rare, basically.
And of course, local is now a kind of byword because obviously since the pandemic, a lot of us have been unable to travel. Um, my question is, what do you think the future is when it comes particularly to the sharp end of birding, the twitchers? What is the future? Because, you know, it's kind of a little bit frowned upon now, people sort of jumping on planes and traveling the breadth of the country to potentially see a particular species. So what is the future now, considering, you know, the climate change aspects?
Yeah, so I guess, I mean, there could still be, there could easily be a future in twitching, but low carbon twitching. So there's no reason. I've seen on Twitter lots of people making some quite epic journeys sometimes by public transport, for instance, or even at least car sharing. Obviously, more difficult now in the pandemic. There is a possibility to reduce that impact by traveling slower or traveling by public transport, etc. And then there's, you know, sort of stepping back from those rare birds and concentrating more on finding rare birds more locally, because, you know, rarity is always relative. You know, we might think of vagrancy as an absolute definition of a bird outside of its geographic range area, but, you know, if I find a yellowhammer anywhere in my local valley here in the Peak District tomorrow, I'll be absolutely over the moon. You know, I've seen Lapland bunting and snow bunting locally here in North Derbyshire, but never a yellowhammer because they don't occur here, right? So although it's scarcely a vagrant, and certainly not in national terms, locally it's super rare and obviously is interesting to me. And there's always the chance of finding something rare, even here. You know, I've seen dusky thrush in the Peak District as well, not a bird I found, but, you know, if more people are out there and looking, we will find more rarities, you know, wherever we are. So I think a combination of staying more local and trying to travel more greener will probably be the future. I think it's even more frowned upon to be sort of traveling the lengths and breadths of the whole Palearctic to chase rare birds. Something I've done myself. You know, I've twitched aziotit in Finland, for instance, you know, whatever it was, 15 years or so ago. Not something I would do again, not something particularly frowned upon then, but I think, you know, we're all more attuned to trying to reduce our combined carbon footprints. And I think, yeah, we can do what we can, I guess.
Yeah, that also means do more urban birding. So
absolutely, yeah. Do more birding wherever you are, and certainly urban birding is quite possibly a better bet than. I don't want to upset. I could list some certain bird observatories in the UK, which I'm sure probably get fewer rare birds than some hotspots in London, for instance. And just thinking about Siberian passerines recently. So, you know, and thinking about what more would be found there if there were people birding that like it was the coast, for instance.
Yeah.
I think I think we're a bit hung up because we think about these Siberian passerines, we just think coast, right? And these birds have just spent most of their entire movement from Siberia to here was inland, right? I mean, the fact they got to the coast, got to the North Sea coast, hopped over the North Sea, you know, there might be a little bit of concentration impact. Many of those birds overflown the North Sea and then ended up making first landfall a long way inland as well. And if people aren't looking, well, they don't get found.
Yeah, it's interesting because I've always, in the beginning, in the early days of me going to Worm and Scrubs, I was laughed at when autumn came. Instead of rushing off to some headland, I'd rush in the middle of the city. I remember one year in the spring, there was a fall of maybe 11,000 spotted flycatchers along the coast near Portland in Dorset. And, you know, I thought, wow, I mean, I'd love to see that. But then I thought, hang on, let's leave it a couple of days and see what filters through. And my local patch in West London, of course, when I went to my local patch, I found about 14 spotted flycatchers, which for me was amazing because they're my birds. I discovered them, you know. And I can also add to the history. I can submit this record, and it's part of the ornithological knowledge that we have. I want to ask you one sort of question that has always bugged me most of my life, or most of my conscious life, when it comes to birding. When you talk about Nearctic vagrants, birds from North America, basically appearing in Britain, I always wondered, why has there never been a ruby-throated hummingbird? Given that they sort of fly out into the sea to get down into South America, you know, why?
Yeah, so the reason, I wrote a paper on this quite a long time ago with Ian McLaren, a Canadian ornithologist, and we basically looked at what were the life history characteristics, the ecological traits, if you like, the size, shape, and fat reserves of different Nearctic, neotropical migrants in fact, just different North American birds to understand which ones showed up, right? And the birds we tend to get in the UK tend to be species which migrate to South America, which is a longer distance, so they're putting on more fat reserves. They tend to be birds which are longer winged, which again also tends to be birds which are flying further. They tend to be birds which are commoner. If there are more of them, they're more likely to go wrong, etc. And often tend to be species which have this sort of transoceanic component. So ruby-throated hummingbird ticks some of those boxes. It's a migratory species. They sort of get down into Central America and the Caribbean. There are records out as far as Bermuda, which is about 1,000 miles offshore from the US East Coast. But we do know with ruby-throated hummingbird that its flight range, that how far it can physically fly before running out of steam, is probably a lot less than the entire width of the Atlantic. Basically, it seems they can probably fly for about 2 days or so. But even with 2 days or so, that's probably enough to make it to the Azores. So it is, I think, a putative vagrant to the Western Palearctic, to the Azores. But the data we have in hand shows it's very unlikely to make it all the way across. Although, imagine if you were doing a trans-Atlantic crossing on an ocean liner and you were there with a hummingbird feeder, where you remove that barrier to that bird crossing, for instance. And that might sound like a silly thing to say, but a lot of our birds, a lot of our Nearctic vagrants almost certainly which are actually a lot worse at long distance flights than ruby-throated hummingbirds, things like lark sparrow and even red-breasted nuthatch, almost certainly arrived sort of aided by boats to a greater or lesser extent, basically. And that happens routinely, almost certainly across the world, birds using boats as stepping stones.
Yeah, okay. Listen, we've got time for one quick question. Gus Wilson, do you want to come on and quickly ask your question? And Alex has got to answer in 2 minutes. So, Gus, you're on.
Oh, hey, Alex.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, I can't get my camera going, but hopefully you can hear me. What do you think is the upper limit for the British list in our lifetimes? We're on about 628, is it now?
Something like that. I'm on the BOERC and I can't actually remember it off the top of my head, so I'll believe 68.
Not endless splits and armchair ticks. I'm thinking real birds.
Real birds. So I don't know. We're sort of averaging at 1, 2, 3 a year or whatever. So it's continuing to creep up. We've got impacts of climate change potentially shaping species distributions and co-distributions. So depending on what the weather starts getting incredibly erratic, and we might get more vagrancy. That will be after that will be at less vagrancy, because if when the climate changes rapidly, then lots of bird species will go south and decline very rapidly. But there may be a phase of very unstable weather and more vagrancy. Certainly, 30 or 40 obvious things which we could easily get if you start looking at what's occurred elsewhere in Western Europe, for instance, and then factor in these changes. You're looking at desertification in the south, all these David will know, all these North African species colonizing Spain, for instance. So there'll be more vagrancy, northward movements associated with that. Species which now only occur in southern France might spread north, and resident species which brings them in range to occur as vagrants. Because resident species, the vagrancy that they perform tends to be of a much smaller scale than migratory species. But as species ranges shift, then and they come closer to the UK, then vagrancy becomes more likely. So, in our lifetimes, 40 or 50, but over geological time, then huge differences, and species going extinct and evolving, and major climate change instances and such like. So, but yeah, ballpark around that, I guess.
Okay, now, thanks a lot for that, by the way, Gus. Listen, Paul Archer, quickly, in 30 seconds, your question, and even quicker, your answer, Alex. Go, Paul.
Hi, Alex.
Hey.
Yeah, I suppose you sort of answered it there a second ago, but I guess the question really is around climate change and its impact on the occurrence of extremely unexpected or unpredictable vagrants in recent years, white-chinned petrel, short-tailed shearwater, and the likes.
Yeah.
Do we have more to worry about there?
So for brown booby, it's difficult to tell if it could be slightly climate change, but it's also range expansion for these species. So the formerly persecuted in you know, as lots of seabirds were in their colonies in Cape Verde and such like. And these species are rebounding, you know, populations are going back. So this might be sort of the expanding fringe of the population of these species. Things like short-tailed shearwaters, well, were we just missing them? You know, in amongst all the sooties, for instance. White-chinned petrel seems less so, but maybe that's just a 50-year bird, for instance. Or maybe there is, you know, changes in the way these birds are using the oceans, changes in weather patterns, which might mean they're more likely to cross the doldrums, for instance. Tough to tell. I think, you know, it could be a combination of both.
All right. Thanks a lot for your question, Paul. Now, I've got 2 more questions for you, Alex, before you have to go. Question number 1, what is your favorite bird?
Very difficult question. I was ruminating on this when you said, oh, you were going to ask me the other day, and I'm trying to think, well, what's the birds had the biggest impact on me? And I was thinking there's probably like 4 or 5 species which I've seen and then lost control of my faculties, you know, literally started shaking. And when I first found my first harp eagle nest, that happened. When I first saw rufous-vented ground cuckoo, or scaled ground cuckoo actually, in the Brazilian Amazon, that happened. When I found my first Nearctic vagrant in Europe, that happened. Red-eyed vireo on the Isles of Scilly. But it also happened when I found a yellow-browed warbler in the middle of Manchester. Mainly because I thought people would believe me, because I was telling everyone, having just started this university, I was going to find yellow-browed warbler like the next week. And when I did, I was then, without all my relevant kit or whatever, it did manage to get images or whatever. So vagrants are incredibly exciting. So are poorly-known tropical species. And, you know, I get the kick out of all of them, I guess. If
you could be anywhere on this planet, notwithstanding war or COVID, where would it be right now?
Well, either sort of back doing sort of field work in the Amazon, or if I was on holiday, then much closer to home for a low carbon trip to Scilly's or something, which is certainly one of the most beautiful places on Earth and a great place to find rare birds.
Fantastic. Listen, Alex, enjoy this immensely. We could have spoken for another hour. I'm sure all the Zoomers would agree. I know you've got to rush off now, and I'm trying to keep it to time. So thank you so much for your time today.
Okay, thank you very much for having me.
And thank you, Zoomers, as well, for being here. We can say goodbye if you need to go.
Take care.
Thank you, Zoomers, for coming. It's really nice to have seen you all. And don't forget that there's other in conservation weeks coming up. Just to quickly tell you what they are, because I need to quickly remind you. And while I'm doing that, just to let you know that we can, just if you wish, carry on talking for a little bit longer in the Q&A bit. You may need to have a couple of suggestions you want to, or statements or whatever questions you want to voice before we go. But on the 24th of January at 7 p.m, we have a guy called Diego Calderon from Colombia. He'll be talking about birding in Colombia, and especially when the FARC were major forces in the country. And on the 31st of January at 7 p.m. GMT, we got John Dunn back, and he'll be talking about orchids. So that's what's happening. And thank you very much for turning up. And guys, don't forget to keep looking for those rare birds. Keep looking up.